now let's get to the real good stuff that we've been waiting for, which is Mo Elefemi. I hope I said it right. Um, Mo is a traditional astrologer who specializes in solar returns and other Hellenistic or medieval Islamicate timing techniques. She's also versed in some aspects of Vedic astrology, the Vedic astrological tradition. In particular, she focuses on utilizing the lesser dignities such as triplicity, bounds, decans, and she provides extra nuance in delineation. So she brings a whole rich, complex, history to life. So I am really excited for this presentation. When she sent it to me, I was like, wow, this is a lot of new stuff that is not on my radar as someone who's much more of an evolutionary astrologer who deals with more modern stuff. Welcome, Mo. I'll let you talk to everybody and give your presentation.
Okay, well, thanks, Dabney, for the warm introduction. And it's an honor to be speaking for OPA in this capacity. So, given that we are having this wonderful transit that everybody has been buzzing about on social media for the past, oh, I don't know, 2 months, I figured why not talk about it, a couple of weeks after we've gotten used to Jupiter making its grand entrance into the sign where it's exalted. And we'll talk about what that means later. So basically, as of maybe 2 weeks ago, give or take, Jupiter made its way into Cancer and it will stay there until the end of June next year. And so this is great news because if you are more of a traditional astrologer or you think a lot more about essential dignity, this is a major shift in terms of how Jupiter is showing up. Jupiter spent the previous year moving through Gemini, where it is said to be in exile or in detriment, right? So it's a very, very, very dramatic shift in how we experience all the topics related to the greater benefic, as well as the consequences that that might have for the parts of your life that Jupiter is touching. So first, obviously, we're going to talk a little bit about Jupiter and its essences, and I'm going to bring in a lot of context from the types of astrology that I typically frequent and practice. So a little more traditional, and I hope that by the end of this talk, for those of you who are a little skeptical of traditional astrology, maybe you'll see, okay, it's not as scary, but it adds more specific and tangible language that, if workshopped right, you can actually see how to move with it constructively. Then we're going to talk about what, essential dignity is, as well as what it means to be exalted. Then, of course, we have to talk about Cancer as a sign because Cancer shows up in a particular way when you're talking about mundane astrology. Cancer shows up in a particular way when you're evaluating a natal chart. And just the temperament and pacing of Cancer also has an impact on, how Jupiter is manifesting as it moves through the sign. And then finally, I will provide some methods that you could use to assess the effect of Jupiter in Cancer, both on a societal level as well as a personal level. Okay, so of course, we have to talk about what Jupiter is. I mean, it's called the Greater Benefic, not just because quite literally it's large, like the planet itself, but in terms of its beneficence, it's actually a lot greater. I know that, and this is me getting into my Vedic astro bag, but some texts in the Vedic tradition actually suggest that Venus is more of a obvious overt benefic. But again, that's not a consistent viewpoint held by all authors, right? However, in general, Jupiter is the louder benefic. So, pulling in a lot of what I've learned from Hellenistic astrology, as well as some of the more traditional aspects of astrology, Jupiter is one of the diurnal sect planets. So, if you are familiar with Hellenistic astrology, their sect is a very core interpretive principle for how planets show up and sort of what their virtues and limitations are, right? So there's the daytime team and there's the nighttime team, essentially. And so the daytime team consists of the sun, which is the luminary of the sect, Jupiter, which embodies the highest ideals and good of the sect, and then Saturn, which provides the surmountable difficulties and challenges of the sect. And for the nighttime team, this would be the moon as the main luminary, Venus as the highest good, Mars as that constructive challenge, right? Anyway, Jupiter is also a fun planet because temperament-wise, it is said to be hot and wet. And if you know anything about some of the ancient temperament qualities, you need some degree of wetness and heat to be life-giving. Because when you don't have enough heat and wetness, it just doesn't allow for things to be born. So that's why Jupiter often gets associated with things like wealth and procreation and fecundity, right? In some astrological traditions, Jupiter rules things like semen, literally, or children and abundance. And I know that in older cultures, having a lot of children was seen as a sign of wealth, right? Jupiter also gets associated with things like morality, right? And philosophy and beliefs. And there's this core association with truth, right? So obviously Jupiter being such a good planet and in the same sect as the sun, which is, typically the monarch or like the ultimate authority, Jupiter ends up describing the nobility as well. So lots of good things associated with Jupiter as a planet. Uh, Jupiter, especially when you're evaluating professions and just people in mundane context. So when I say mundane, I mean the astrology of world events. You could say that these types of people would often be judges, stewards of legal and moral codes, nobles, people of high rank, things like that. So those are the types of characters that you would associate with this planet. Notice how I didn't mention like famous people, because that's more, I would say, of a Venusian, if not in some cases, solar manifestation. Okay, so the next thing we have to talk about is essential dignity because it's core to understanding how Jupiter or any other planet manifests when it ingresses into a sign and spends time there. So I always love having conversations about dignity because I'm like, what does it mean to be dignified anyway? Or as I've said in previous talks I've given, what the heck is dignity? Like people throw it around, and I know it's gotten really popular, especially with people getting into things like electional astrology when you're planning to do things and take advantage of really good astrological configurations, or if you're into astrological magic and things like that, which is a more advanced version of some of the electional stuff. Um, so dignity, a lot of where I get my understanding of this actually comes from a course I took and watched with Robert Hand. I know that he's done a lot of work in both modern and traditional astrology, so I consider him like astrology, Santa Claus, or Jesus. And it's funny that I mention him because he actually does have Jupiter in Cancer, funnily enough, I believe on his ascendant. So very timely person to invoke during this particular talk. But dignity is a concept that allows us to really understand how a planet is able to carry out certain actions. And there are two camps of dignity. There's accidental dignity and essential dignity. So, accidental dignity is all about a planet's ability to carry out its function based on its location and relationship to the chart. So, you'll hear about things like angularity, right? That's one form of accidental dignity because planets are more or less active because of their relationship to the angles. There's other things like some would argue that sect is kind of a form of accidental dignity. It's like, okay, how does this planet relate to the chart? Where is it located? Is it in sect? Is it in the right solar phase? There are lots of other qualities, right? But then essential dignity refers to a planet's ability to carry out significations that are inherent to its nature. Basically, as Rob Hand put it, how can a planet be itself? Does a planet feel empowered to be itself, right? I would say both forms of dignity, but especially essential dignity, carries connotations of social expectation. I know there's a lot of debate on the internet about essential dignity is not necessarily about resource because there are plenty of people with debilitated planets or planets with poor dignity that have a lot of resource, but you can't deny that typically when you conform to social expectations, you are generally well resourced. So I wouldn't count that out, but emphasis on meeting social expectations. Basically, is the planet able to be itself in a way that doesn't garner pushback or yields favorable outcomes because it's doing that in a container of societal expectation that's appropriate. Um, So a lot of you have probably seen some variation of this table here in the top right. There are five levels of essential dignity in Western or non-Indic astrology. The reason I say that is because they don't really do triplicity. They've got like a different planetary friendship scheme going on, and there are different levels of exaltation and own sign. But to keep it simple for today, Western astrology, five levels of essential dignity. The ones that everyone are familiar with are domicile versus detriment, or exaltation versus fall. So when a planet isn't domicile, it's said to be in its own sign. It's basically the ruler of the sign, right? It regulates its own affairs and it's generally secure. It's kind of like the master of its own house. No one can tell it what to do, right? Exaltation, a planet that is uplifted, it represents the highest good of that planet's nature. It's like the most constructive manifestation of whatever that planet could be. It's like an esteemed guest or other person who commands praise. Then you've got the lower tiers of dignity. I mean, I don't consider them lower, but they do add more nuance and they're not as, dramatic as the first two. Triplicity is basically when a planet has sect or elemental agreement with a sign in terms of its temperament. It functions like being surrounded by allies and protectors. So you'll see here that there's the Dorothean triplicity lords, where there is a primary ruler in the daytime, the second ruler, who is usually like also the primary ruler in a night chart. And then there's always like a cooperating ruler as well. Triplicity has fun applications, like you can evaluate eminence by looking at how angular all three lords are. You could also say, okay, can a particular planet or significator see its triplicity lords? Because that will guarantee that that planet has approval to do the things that it wants to do, things like that. Bounds or terms that, or the terms. So when a planet is here, they are said to be either amongst relatives, or other analogies I've seen are it's like being the mayor of a city, or, it's like you own a room in a house and you can kind of achieve the goals of a particular sign in a way that's more authentic to you, right? The other nice thing about bounds is that bounds where there are benefic planets ruling them are more constructive in their manifestations, whereas malefic bounds can bring about challenge, right? Um, and then finally, decans, which are also known as dignity by face. It's like a planet that's in its village, and in some contexts, people have described decans as when planets are in their own decan, they must get on by their skills and abilities, unlike something that is inherent to their nature or because of, their relationships to other people. The other nice thing about decans is that they have a symbolic richness to them in terms of how they manifest. So even when planets are not in their own decan, right? It's like, okay, there are lots of narratives that go, or depictions of types of people, and so it ends up being a very interesting form of essential dignity that also has like I want to say spiritual or metaphysical implication. So, for example, I always recommend that people look at the decan of their ascendant, right? And any narratives and descriptions that are associated with it, because it actually tells you a lot about how you function as a person. Do the same thing for your midheaven, says a lot about your life purpose, right? And what that looks like. Now, as you know, the opposite of domicile is adversity, exile, detriment. It's so think of it as being in a place that's very antithetical to your customs, and no one really, cares about you. There's lots of foreign connotation and estrangement, right? Um, the opposite of exaltation is fall. So whereas other people are lifting you up with exaltation during fall or depression, um, people are actively trying to push you down. Think of it like people trying to witch hunt you, essentially, right? And so those are the levels of essential dignity, which could be helpful to think about. Now, a common question that people have is which is better, domicile or exaltation? And most texts, from what I've seen, whether you're looking at the point score for evaluating almutans, which is basically the planet that has the most dignity over a house cusp, an angle, you know, um, or some other lot or something like that, they'll usually rank domicile over exaltation. However, I have seen some authors say that when you are evaluating the rank or eminence of a person's chart, you would rank exaltation over domicile because, I mean, the exaltation has that like kingly elevated by other people status. Not that domicile doesn't also yield good outcomes there. It's just that when you are trying to figure out who's going to be the most famous or who's going to have the most authority, you may want to look at exaltation over domicile. And this is a great segue into Cancer because it's the sign where Jupiter exalts. But before we get to that point, we want to think about the nature, correspondences, and significations of the fourth zodiac sign, right? I love Cancer as a sign because it's cardinal and ruled by the moon, so it's very, very changeable, right? And I think people underestimate how changeable Cancer is as a sign because usually when people have conflated changeable with mutable, but mutability is more about being dual in nature and maybe in between things. There's a liminality there. Whereas Cancer, not that Cancer doesn't have some liminal qualities, but it is a cardinal sign. So it is trying to bring about some kind of change, right? So it it gets its liminality probably from the moon and its, fluctuating but cyclical nature, but still a cardinal sign, right? Like other water signs, it is phlegmatic in temperament. So I always say that water signs, because they're both cold and wet, they're either looking for a container to consolidate in, or they want to be a container that envelops things. Like, I mean, think about when an object gets wet. There's like a layer of water that's coating it, right? Or water tends to fill up, and other liquids tend to fill up the containers that they're in, right? When you're thinking about Cancer, it's a very fertile sign, if not the most fertile of the water signs. Could be Pisces as well, just because the benefics do well in Pisces as well. But Cancer and Pisces are kind of battling it out for most fertile. Um, it's associated with people who are salt of the earth, so very down to earth, very simple, not complex, not unassuming people. And it's said to be mute in voice, as all water signs are. Um, there's more of an intuitive, implicit way through which Cancer communicates, unlike, the air signs, which are very vocal. Cancer gets associated with people like mothers and families, people who wander because of the moon, sailors, some people of high rank, or people who are likable and popular, because again, in a lot of other contexts, the moon says things about people, right? Those who dig canals, mystics, and other religious leaders can also be associated with Cancer. So when Jupiter is here, not only is it exalted, it is associated with benefit from religious leaders, those of high rank, and increased fecundity. And I don't know if some of you follow Dr. Ali A. Alomi, who does a lot of wonderful translations of medieval Islamicate astrological scholars. He also mentions that because Cancer is a sign that does get associated with women, he mentions that sometimes there can be a woman of high rank that can also, you know, become more prominent during this particular period. Okay. So diving into some other things that are associated with Cancer, if you're thinking about mundane astrology, the astrology of world events, you can sometimes see that signs get assigned to different places, whether they're actual countries, regions, or like geographies and places that you would see in cities. So China, Islamic lands often get associated with Cancer, rivers, places of worship, reservoirs, wells, wetlands, jungles, those types of places. When you're thinking in a health context, the chest, the breast, the stomach, the spleens, in some context or some texts, the heart I've seen, or some aspects of the heart. Um, Sometimes some of the reproductive organs as well, because of the ties to the moon, which can be associated with things like the uterus. Um, Types of animals, obviously aquatic animals and those with many legs, lobster, crab, the usual, the fun stuff. And then some of the fun mundane effects that happen when Cancer is on the ascendant in the Aries ingress, which is the chart that you should use when you are evaluating the quality of a year, is that there can be increases in procreation. So people are having more kids, people are moving around more, lots of flooding, people are digging waterways. So lots of projects that may enhance how water is moving. You may see a lot of increases in food and drink, and there may be fluctuations in anxiety amongst people, just thinking about the changeability of the moon there. And I would imagine the extent to which that is true depends on the condition of the moon in that particular chart. So, even more context on Cancer as the exaltation of Jupiter. And so there are several texts that lay out how the exaltations were assigned, right? So if any of you are familiar with, again, more of the traditional forms of astrology, the Thema Mundi is the hypothetical birth chart of the universe. And Jupiter was assigned the exaltation of Cancer because it is the benefic that has the greatest capacity for giving life, right? Cancer is also a very fertile, wet sign. And what they wanted to honor was the idea that cardinal signs have that initiatory energy required to bring about life, right? Birthing is a very initiatory and, I always joke, kind of violent process, right? And only cardinal signs really have that energy. The fixed signs don't really have that, nor do the mutables, right? Aries and Cancer, of all the cardinal signs, were associated with that increase in light because a lot of these astrologies and how they were conceptualized were associated with cultures that came from the northern hemisphere, right? Unlike Capricorn and Libra. And so the other malefics, the malefics actually exalt in Libra and Capricorn because their qualities towards decrease, even though they are about change, it's a change towards decrease. It's tempering the quality of those malefics. So the sun gets Aries as exaltation because it's the manifestation of the soul. And then Jupiter, it's the giver of life, is exalted in Cancer as a result. The other fun thing is that if you think about the theme of Mundi and how things are configured, so you'll note that the signs in which the diurnal planets, so the Sun, Saturn, and Jupiter, are configured to one of their domiciles by trine. So, for example, what I mean by that is Jupiter exalts in Cancer, which is in a trine with its domicile Pisces, if you use the traditional ruler scheme, right? Um, Saturn exalts in Libra, which is in a trine to Aquarius, its other domicile. And obviously the sun in Aries would trine Leo, right? So the opposite would be true for the exaltations of the nocturnal planets. So they would have their configurations to a sextile with one of their domiciles. So Venus exalts in Pisces, which can see Taurus by trine. Um, not Saturn, Mars exalts in Capricorn, which sees its other domicile, Scorpio, by sextile. The moon exalts in Taurus, who sees its domicile in Cancer by sextile. So there are lots of fun mathematical things that explain how the system came to be. Lots of debate on whether this is just how things are innately or if this was delicately constructed. However, the symmetry is very appreciated and the logic is very sound when you think about how this lays on to the essential dignity scheme as well. Okay. So now to the real meat and potatoes of this talk. We want to know, how do we assess the effects of Jupiter in Cancer? And I just want to give you a little bit of a framework so that you can think about how, Jupiter in Cancer will feel on a societal level as well as a personal level. So there are lots of different techniques we can do. Obviously, there are levels, different devils. So mundane astrology, like I said, astrology of world events, you can do it for empires, countries, I mean, even your local city, right? And I highly recommend rooting the impacts of Jupiter and Cancer to the Aries ingress in which it's found. So I know that by transit, Jupiter will be in Cancer for much of this year, but the Aries ingress we had this year, actually Jupiter in Gemini. So we're still going to really feel those effects. Not that Jupiter in Cancer as a transit is not doing anything. It's just that in terms of consequence for the world and like a root chart for the world, I think a lot of that's not going to be realized until next year, right? Natal astrology, obviously the astrology of specific individuals. So this is where you would look at, so before I get ahead of myself, when you're thinking about evaluating a nativity, you have to think about, a lot of timing techniques, right? So I contend that astrology, I think this is actually on the next slide, but I contend that astrology, even if it's psychological in nature, is inherently predictive because when you're telling somebody about the type of person they are, you're making predictions about how they're going to be, right? And there's also the predicting of, events. And there are lots of great techniques in astrology where you look at, for example, changes in temperament between the natal chart and the solar return, and some other timing techniques where you can actually see, hey, this is the type of person you're going to be this year. This is how you're going to feel. And also, here's what's happening to you. And so the nice thing is that with traditional as well as Vedic astrology, there's always these larger systems through which you are identifying key planets and points that are activated for you. And so I'll have like an outline on how you can evaluate what's going on in your natal chart. And then finally, as I mentioned, electional astrology, if you want to plan to do something so that you can get good results, great time to take advantage of Jupiter. Okay, not while Jupiter is squaring Saturn right now, but maybe in a few weeks. And especially when Saturn's back in Pisces, because then at least Saturn is received by an exalted ruler. And Saturn is not fallen like it is right now in Aries. So I think that there's some good pockets of time, maybe late summer, fall, that could be good for taking advantage of Jupiter's enhanced beneficence. Okay, so making sense of timing. So this is going to be true for both mundane and natal, right? Because a lot of the techniques you would use to evaluate a natal chart, you would kind of do similar things for um, a mundane chart. And so, as I said, inherently predictive in nature. You are making assumptions about how a person is, what's going to happen to them, what the state of the world is based on these correspondences, right? And so, in forms of astrology that don't shy away from prediction as a concept, there's this idea that certain charts and activations will take precedence over others and influence their expression. So, um, obviously, there's a root chart that you're working with. This could be like a key Aries ingress. This could be obviously someone's natal chart, right? And then there are epoch lords, which are said to divide up larger slices of time. I'm talking several years at a time, right? And the planet and or sign that is activated and its qualities will be more influential and descriptive of what's happening. Then you have the annual lords that show up on a yearly basis. So it's like, okay, these things are happening in this year and they're colored by this planet and this sign, right? And when there's alignment between those bigger chapters and the yearly lords, which act like, sentences or individual pages, right? That's when you get major events, and that's what I call stacked testimony, right? And then even though we have these lords, right, you can't just take what they're doing in the root chart as gospel, because the root chart is a static chart. And so what happened in that transition from Hellenistic to medieval Islamic astrology was that there was a lot of development and iteration of some of these other charts that could allow you to kind of see what is actually happening in, I don't want to say real time, but almost. Because, the root chart is always going to be static. But if you have another chart you can compare it to, right? Which this would be like an Aries ingress, or for a person, a solar return. This acts as sort of like a vehicle that allows the promise of the root chart to come alive while also providing additional context into, what's going on, maybe more real time, right? It's like a snapshot of, the sun's ingress into Aries, or, the sun returning to its natal position for an individual. So yeah. So we're going to start with mundane, and I will say that mundane astrology is very complicated and the subject can be a little touchy. So if this is not your cup of tea, that's okay. Please tread carefully as you are engaging with this subject. So think of the Aries ingress chart as the solar return of the world. And I'm saying the world loosely. Basically, what you would do is you want to take the Aries ingress chart of whichever empire, hegemon, what have you, is very dominant in the world, right? Because that will affect what everybody's doing. Obviously, you can do the same for your country or even your city, right? Because there may be some insights that you can derive there too, right? But basically, what happened was that the Persian and Islamic astrologers developed this very complicated system for evaluating changes in, dynasties and empires over, centuries in some cases, right? In fact, the Association for Young Astrologers had somebody present, I think it was Blaise Max. Yes, Blaise Maximus, who presented on both just how to interpret these larger cycles, as well as using the Aries ingress on an annual basis. Because you don't just take the Aries ingress, you actually have to think about the Saturn Jupiter conjunction cycles, because those are the larger time cycles within which all of these ingresses are nested, right? And each one of those core charts has a theme, and you always want to relate it back to the theme. But again, that's advanced and beyond the scope of this talk today. But what I will say is that for your more immediate term predictions, it's very helpful to at least compare the Aries ingress of the year that you're in with the most recent Saturn Jupiter conjunction, because then you can see, like, okay, this is the 20-year period that we're in. How does this chart relate to that one? Um, there are also basically yearly transfers or perfections that are happening from that Saturn Jupiter conjunction chart, right? And so you want to see what those planets are doing in the current Aries ingress. So when you're interpreting, I've already jumped ahead of myself. You want to look at the ascendant first and foremost of any Aries ingress, because the modality tells you how many ingress charts you'll need to cast. So if it's cardinal, you'll need to do all four for each of the seasons, right? If it's mutable, you'll need to cast the Libra ingress. If it's fixed, just take the Aries ingress as is. The sign and the ruler tell you who, what, and which places are impacted, and you want to look at which planets are aspecting the ascendant. The moon will describe the people's condition. The lords of the year will describe uh, main conditions. So the lords of the year could be, you want to take at least one of the superior planets, which would be Saturn, Jupiter, or Mars. And the reason I say that is because of how they're oriented to the Earth. Because unlike the interior planets or inferior planets, they're in between the Earth and the Sun, right? So they can't move far from the Sun, whereas the other three, you can actually get oppositions between the Sun and Mars and Jupiter and Saturn, right? So you want at least one of them, and then whichever other planet is the most angular with not bad dignity, those would be the lords of the year, right? Um, the transfers, as I mentioned, you want to look at in that Saturn, that Aries ingress, which was the same year of the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction, that is closest to your Aries ingress. You want to see where the ascendant perfects to, because that will tell you, okay, what are some changes in events? Perfections from that midheaven in that chart will describe changes in the actions of lawmakers and authorities. And you want to see where that Saturn-Jupiter conjunction perfects to in that chart as well. So for example, the 2020 Aries ingress, which was the year that we had that Saturn-Jupiter conjunction in Aquarius, Aquarius would be that sign where the conjunction was, right? Even though in the actual ingress, I think they were still both in Capricorn, but know that the conjunction happened in Aquarius, right? So you want to basically perfect from Aquarius in that chart for the next, like, well, not 20 years now, but like 20 years from 2020, right? And you want to see where that conjunction falls because then it shows the societal impact of whatever that conjunction was about. Advanced is like, okay, there are bigger time lords for the Aries ingress. You can familiarize yourself with them for more precision, and I recommend joining the Association for Young Astrologers to actually access those resources. Um, okay. However, as I said, um, we want to see what Jupiter and Cancer means in this chart, right? Because that's the focus. I don't want to spend too much time interpreting this one, but basically, this is the 2026 Aries ingress where we will actually have um, Jupiter in Cancer. So quickly looking at the ascendant, Gemini rising, you already know we need to cast the Libra ingress. Could be interesting to look at. And for context, because the US right now is top of global order, this chart was cast for Washington, D.C., just so you know. Um, anyway, so when we think about why this year is special, if you go to the 2020 chart, the midheaven in that chart actually perfects to Pisces. So Jupiter in Cancer in this Aries ingress is saying something about what the focus of lawmakers will be in this year. And so because Jupiter um, is in Cancer, it's in its exaltation. Jupiter obviously says things about people with resources and wealth. Jupiter's also in the second house too, right? So, and I believe Jupiter looks like it's at about max exaltation. So this year, the leader will definitely be very focused on bringing value to the wealthiest segments of society, right? I think in the other text, it was one of Abu Mashar's texts on religions and dynasties. He mentions that the head of state may be more inclined towards wasteful spending and transitioning between residences, right? That shows up. Um, Other things about this chart as well. The ruler of the chart, Mercury, who is not doing so hot, being both fallen and in exile in Pisces, right? Um, Not doing great. So this configuration to me, like that trine between the two, based on what Abu Mashar wrote, suggests that while the focus may be on wealth generation for big businesses, partially because Mercury is in the 10th, right? There may be ideological disputes about missteps and approaches here that lead to litigation, given the fact that Mercury is also conjoined to Mars, right? In fact, that Mars, Jupiter trine to one another suggests that it's also a time of warfare and conflict and rebellion. I mean, Mars, Jupiter aspects and mundane can have to do with stimulation of rebellion. There could be this could be a time for ideological disputes and conflict, right? Um, Jupiter is also receiving an overcoming square from Venus, who is not very well dignified in Aries. And Jupiter receiving that square, but being in the um, inferior position just because it's later in the zodiac. So Venus is kind of making some demands on Jupiter, suggests that any women tied to the ruling class will be seeking to live well and flaunt the good life for themselves. And given the condition of that Venus, I'm not sure that will be well received by most people. So think of, I don't know when Jeff Bezos and his wife are going to get married finally, but whatever ostentatious and obnoxious things they're doing, like will probably be a point of contention, right? Especially as people are struggling to, live and things like that. Okay. Now we go to natal, which is probably going to have more relevance for most people here. So basically, Jupiter in Cancer will be especially potent for you as a transit if, for example, you're a mutable rising or have the midheaven in or IC in Pisces or Sagittarius, right? Um, if Jupiter is returning to Cancer in your solar return because you have Jupiter in Cancer natally, right? If the perfection is also coming to Cancer from one of the points of life, so this could be the ascendant, the midheaven, the lot of fortune, and your sect light, whether that's the sun or the moon. The other thing that could be useful is that if Jupiter is activated as a Time Lord, right? So, like I said, through the perfections, there's another technique called the Lord of the Turn that's beyond the scope of today. And if you're Epochal Lord or its helper, so the Fardar or its helper, is Jupiter. So great segue into these different Time Lord techniques, right? So Ferdaria is one of those epochal Time Lord systems that defines chapters of life based on planets. The order of these is determined by sect. So day charts get one sequence, nighttime charts get another sequence. Each Fardar has a helper which colors how that planet can manifest its core significations, and the conditions of both planets in the natal chart will say something about how that period goes, but you want to see what they're doing in the solar return as well. Annual perfections, like I said, think about it as the chart moving symbolically one sign over every solar return, right? I mentioned the 4 points of life because they determine your experience and focus for the year. And then there's finally the Lord of the Turn technique, which it's based on your planetary hour of birth. So starting with that hour, each whole sign house or each sign gets, assigned a planetary lord. Obviously, there are 7 hours and there are 12 houses, so some of them will repeat. And the condition of that planet in the solar return will provide more nuance as to how you experience the year. So I chose two examples from the royal family because they both happen to have activations in either Pisces or Cancer, right? And they happen to be two that are not getting along. So first of them, Prince William, right? So Jupiter is actually going to be the helper for part of this year, but he will move into that Mars period, right? With Mars as the helper. Um, he's actually in a Cancer perfection. So, and if you look at the chart on the left, this is his natal. This is his solar return that started, I think, yesterday, actually. Um, Now, this is interesting because his solar return ascendant is in Cancer. So, yes, it's great because Jupiter is moving through this sign, but one of the first things that you should do when you look at the solar return chart is look at the modality of the ascendant. Cardinal, lots of change really quickly, especially in the first half of the year. If it's fixed, it's pretty steady and consistent throughout the year. If it's mutable, things probably started 3 months before your solar return. Things will probably still be concluding 3 months after into the next solar return. So it's like the never-ending liminal space. But lots of change for Prince William in the next 6 months, I would imagine. Um, when you look at these planets, you also want to see what's happening in the sign of Cancer. So it's interesting because Jupiter is doing much better in his return chart than natal. So I know that his Jupiter's technically on the midheaven, right? It's dynamically angular, but by whole signs, it's kind of cadent, right? And he's got a really cadent midheaven, which is really interesting symbolism there. But then he's got this Jupiter that actually has really strong dignity going into the first. And so one thing that I wrote is that he may be coming out of obscurity to be celebrated. However, because that Jupiter is in the 12th natally by whole sign, there is still like a 12th house quality to it, right? So perhaps elevation and identity comes through some kind of, loss, right? Jupiter's also conjoining his sun. And so when a planet conjoins a natal planet, I mean, the sun is returning to its same position as well. It's also returning on behalf of the moon too, because he's got that moon at 4 Cancer. So Jupiter's returning on behalf of both, and there are certain combinations you can get when certain planets are returning on behalf of other planets that can tell you something about how you experience that. So based on some of the texts that I was reading, it implies benefit from fathers, possibly some anxiety from an authority figure, and eventual relief from adversity. Again, I think pointing to some kind of elevation for him. Um, do note that the moon, who rules the chart, right, and it's also one of his time lords for the year, is at max exaltation in the 11th in this return chart, applying to that Jupiter after, but also applying to the Mars. So I think that again, it's pointing to that trine to Mars, maybe some like loss or change or conflict or competition, and then that paving way for immediate elevation, right? The other thing that's going on in this return chart is there's like this fun assemblage. So there are fun combinations that you can look for in terms of how things are distributed in solar return charts. But basically, if planets are all the planets, ignore the malefics. So basically look at what the sun, Jupiter, Mercury, Venus, and the moon are doing. If they're all in whole sign angles or succeedant houses, including the eighth, but the eighth kind of like takes away from it a little bit. Or if they're co-present with like the midheaven or the IC as well, that counts too. Um, it's said to be an assemblage that implies advancement. So this is a year where he would be rising in some way, or things would be progressing in some way. And so taken together, I feel like this is a year where William would have authority, praises, and honors come to him. It looks like a great chart for, if not ascension to the throne, if I'm going to be completely honest with you, it does look like some increased influence over royal assets. I do think that there's some great cost or loss that may be incurred. I mean, the natal eighth is rising, right? We can't ignore that. The moon, yes, it's in the return 11th, but that's his natal sixth, right? So, and actually, it's pretty close to his IC in the sixth too, right? So, like, there's a lot of nuance that can be derived from that there. Now, the other person in question, Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. Of course, I picked the two royals that are beefing. So she is going into a Pisces perfection this August. And I think her midheaven, which is her other point of life, is perfecting to Sagittarius. And so basically, what you have to understand about what it means, what the difference between perfecting from different points is. So, for example, the ascendant says things about just main events of the year, perfecting from the midheaven says things about like status and career. Perfecting from the lot of fortune says things about your material conditions, and perfecting from your sect light just says things about how you feel about the year and how you're moving through the year, right? So when we look at her ascendant, she's got that Aquarius ascendant. So I think her year, the pacing of it is a lot more steady and consistent. However, I do find it fascinating that she also has the return ascendant falling in her natal eighth. So that is implying that topics around inheritance, loss, legacy, all coming up, right? Also, just other people's resources and even things like anxiety, right? That can also come up as well. Um, Jupiter being one of her time lords from the ascendant and midheaven, saying things about both just events that are happening and how that affects her reputation. Jupiter is moving from the fourth to the sixth. Um, so I like what Jupiter's doing. I don't like that Jupiter is in the sixth in the return. I do like that it's not with Saturn because her Saturn's overpowered, to be honest. And So it's like a mixed bag, right? So I do feel like there is some elevation or support that comes from common or lower people, or as a result of like real estate related matters. Maybe there's some like land related conservation project. I don't know. It could be something like that. There could also be some connotations of making peace with family members that are inimical, to you. And I think illness of one of those people may play a part in that, just because of, again, that condition of both of those planets. Jupiter is conjoining her natal Mars, so it's returning on behalf of Mars. She may derive some benefit through travel, children, and positive interactions with, those in the household of the brother, was one of the quotes of the texts. And I was like, maybe there's a chance that some royal beef will be settled, or maybe just beef with her own siblings, right? Because I know that's a common problem in her own life, right? Um, so as I said, taken together, I feel like aspects of her reputation will be influenced by change in the health and well-being of a relative. There may be a favorable real estate opportunity that benefits common people that will likely also elevate her. She may have opportunity to gather with some people and make peace to gain benefits and support from them. There may be some undermining of status, but I think she'll prevail. So that's sort of how I would put some of those things together. And you could try this out with your own chart, maybe. So these are all the references that I used. Obviously, we stand Abu Mashar in this house. Ben Dykes has a lot of wonderful translations from various authors from this era. Um, Again, the Association for Young Astrologers has a couple of talks that show great examples of how to use this in a mundane context. And of course, we can't not mention Vedis Valens, as well as Ali A. Alomi's Head on History Patreon. If you're not in it, it's the best $5 you'll ever spend in your life. And you will realize that astrology is just a bottomless pit of more texts and things to read. Um, yeah, so if you guys are interested in chatting, yapping about astrology, if you want to consult, feel free to hit me up. My books are very much open, and yeah, ready to take any questions.
That was very, very good. Wow, that was fantastic. So much to absorb for those of us that are not traditional astrologers. There was some really good information in there. So thank you. Thank you, Mo. So you do have a couple questions. Will you please explain how to utilize the perfection technique for a natal chart?
Yes, give me like 2 seconds. I can pull up a chart just so I can explain better.
Yeah, it's very hard to explain the
No, I know it's
thing
it's
without,
helpful with visuals. So I'm just gonna log into my
yeah, take your time.
AstroSeek.
Lots of people with praise and saying
Do
thank
I
you so
want
much.
to share my natal chart? I mean, it's on the astrology podcast. Like, why not?
You could just go back to your slides, and if you want to show one of the other charts, it's fine.
It's just they're not super big. You know what? I'll actually pull up William's chart. I just need 2 seconds to find his chart, because I know on the slides it's actually not as easy to see. Duke of I mean, he's the Prince of Wales now. He's not the Duke anymore. I'm gonna share screen again just so
Okay.
people can see.
Yeah,
Okay, you guys can see my screen, right?
yeah, now we can. Yep.
Okay, so this is Prince William's chart in whole sign houses, right? So the way annual perfections works is that every planet and point, so whether that's Mars, the ascendant, I don't care what it is, think of the actual planets and points moving one sign over, right? Every year. So for example, William is how old now? I think he's 43, right? So when you're born, everything is in its natal position, like symbolically, right? When he turned 1 years old, the ascendant, the lot of spirit, moved to Capricorn. The lot of fortune, south node, moved to Aquarius, and so on and so forth, right? When he turned Two, all those moved to Aquarius. Like everything in his first whole sign house moved into Aquarius and everything else shifted as well, right? And the perfections move, they repeat every 12 years, right? So there's certain ages that get associated with certain signs. And it's actually nice because you can actually go back 12 years and go, okay, I had similar planets active, but what were some differences, right? So how did those solar returns look? What were some other activations I was having? What were some other transits that were going on too, as well? Because that's also helpful framing. It's like, okay, similar topics come up because similar planets were active, right? That's sort of what I want people to think about. Think of it like a clock rotating. There's actually a section. So this is where I plug AstroSeek because their traditional astrology calculator has everything. And they actually show you the perfections from, one, they show you the perfection cycle that you're in, and then they show you, okay, where did the ascendant go? Where did the midheaven go? Where did, the lights go? Where did fortune go? I think you can actually open this up as a standalone calculator, and you can actually see what this looks like from a whole sign perspective, like for the year. And then there's continuous perfections, which I will not overwhelm you with, but everything is technically also moving by degree or something. So, but that's for another day. But there's some tools that could help you visualize this better if this is helpful.
Great. Okay, so the next question. Hi, Mo. Thank you for this comprehensive talk. Could you share the name of the text you referenced to help with your interpretation of the various combinations of SR planets standing for natal planets and SR charts?
Okay, so there's I'm gonna have to roll and grab it. Oh my
Roll and
God.
grab away.
Okay. So it's from a Ben Dykes translation. Partially from a Ben Dykes translation. So I don't know if we can see it, but we can kind of see it. Kind
Um,
of.
Move it to the left a
It's,
little. Okay.
hold on. I don't know
You know
what's
what? Maybe
going
you
on.
could type it in the chat.
You can kind of see it. Abu Mashar on the Revolutions of the Years
Okay.
of Nativities, translated by Ben Dykes. There's also on Dr. Ali A. Alomi's Patreon. I forget which video, but he's got a great series on doing solar return charts, basically. And there's a section where he kind of demonstrates what's described in this part of the book, where he talks about planets returning on behalf of other planets. And I would have to draw it out, but basically what you would do is you would take the planet in the natal chart and make whichever sign or signs it rules the hypothetical ascendant. And you would take the return planet and you would see where its signs fall. So for example, let's say, do I have an example? Okay, we'll take my solar return for this year, for example, right? Because it's easier to demonstrate with like the moon because the moon only rules one sign. It gets confusing when planets rule multiple signs. So my solar return this year has a moon in Sagittarius, right? And it's on my natal Jupiter. And so it's like, okay, Jupiter rules both Sagittarius and Pisces. So in a Pisces rising chart, right? Which whole sign house does the moon rule? Cancer. That's the fifth, right? So there's a fifth house quality. You would say there's something about children, creative pursuits, romance, something that's implied by the moon touching my Jupiter, the return moon touching my natal Jupiter. Now, the Jupiter also rules Sag, right? So make Sag the hypothetical ascendant. What whole sign house is Cancer in a Sag rising chart? Eighth. So there are eighth house topics as well coming up in relation to my return moon touching my natal Jupiter. So if I combine those, it's like, okay, anxieties about creative pursuits, anxieties about reproductive health, anxieties about children. Those are all things that are very much happening for me right now. I can tell you that. So those are it takes like a lot of mental math, but I'm telling you, if you just draw it out, it will make a lot of sense. I just don't have a whiteboard right now, so I can't like do it.
Okay, so this
Um,
leads us to the next question is what books would you start with if you have some familiarity with Hellenistic and want to go deeper, especially about the solar returns? And this will be our final question, just as we're
okay.
wrapping up.
Of course. I think you'll have a great time with any Ben Dykes translation. I highly recommend, obviously, this green book I just showed you, Abu Mashar's On the Revolutions of the Years of Nativities. I think not the Saul book so much because it's not very like timing focused. There's more stuff about like horary and just interpreting like a static natal chart. But definitely if you want solar return stuff, the green book, the Abu Mashar green book is great. I think it's Persian Nativities 4 in that series. If you are interested in some of the mundane stuff, let me just go back to my window if I can find it. There we go. Because I had and you're going to share the slides with them, right? Because I also have all of it
But
listed in there.
I'm not sure if the slides get shared, but this will be back on YouTube.
Okay.
And so people can always come back and reference it.
Okay. So, other
Not
text.
every presenter wants their slides shared. So,
Okay.
but
Oh,
but
well, feel free
it's
to share
always
them with your
okay.
members.
Okay.
Totally fine. If you're interested in the mundane, Abu Mashar's Great Introduction, Book of Religions and Dynasties. I think there's some nice notes about planetary significations and things in Al-Kindi's The 40 Chapters, right? Those are all some great texts to start with. And then just thinking about core significations of planets and signs and even just the meaning of the lots and things. I think Valens has a lot of good stuff. But yeah, I think if you've dipped your toe into Hellenistic, get more into the medieval Islamicate astrologers. There's a lot to play with there, I think.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Mo. This was very stimulating and intellectual, and it really just goes to show that anyone who poo-poos astrology clearly does not know how complex of a study it is. And so thank you for bringing some sort of new information. We got lots of good comments. So please, everyone, join us next July 27th for the next Mercury Hour. And also, please consider becoming OPA members if you are not already. All right. Thank you so much, Mo. Appreciate
Take
it.
care. Bye.